You know what kinds of games I love? Action games and shooter games, preferably with a bit of RPG elements thrown in to add some extra skill layers to the gameplay. I like games where I'm constantly having to focus, to think, to keep mindful of my positioning, my team, and all while I'm engaged in combat that will punish my mistakes, but make me feel accomplished when I overcome it. I was a huge fan of Vermintide 1, and now that the game's been out a while, balanced up a bit and polished, I've put over twice that time into Warhammer Vermintide 2. Over 600 hours, in fact. I love this game, and I think there's a fair amount of you that will feel the same if you decide to delve in. You guys are all familiar with Left 4 Dead, right? You'd better. I'd be shocked if you weren't. Think of Vermintide as the dark fantasy version of that set in the Warhammer universe, with a focus on melee instead of ranged combat. Vermintide has you traversing a wide variety of maps, from forests to castles to sewers to swamps to mines, fighting off enemies and fulfilling objectives along the way to get to the end of the map. Pretty simple premise, nothing too fancy, but what really sets Vermintide apart from other action games are its mixture of fantastic combat and the sheer amount of enemies it will throw your way. You and your 3 teammates will be assaulted by hundreds upon hundreds of foes in hordes during a session. Vermintide stresses good positioning and crowd control skills, knowing how best to move and attack while hacking away at baddies with a wide variety of weapons. Players choose between 5 characters: Marcus Kruber, Victor Saltzpyre, Carillion, Barden Gorkson, and Sienna Fueganassus. Each of the characters has 3 different classes, so Marcus can play as a tough and aggressive foot knight, or he can play as a huntsman who's more of a ranged glass cannon. Carillion can be an agile and relentless handmaiden, or a tank and boss-killing shade. Each class has passive abilities that help lend to their roles in combat, such as damage resistances, better dodging, or more range damage, and some even put out auras like giving nearby friends extra critical hit chances, or extra stamina regeneration. As you level up, you gain a choice of talents that are unique to every class that further enhance your character and give you different options for how you want to play and what you think is most useful. And this is essentially how you spec your class. One of the most important being how your character gains temporary health for damaging and staggering enemies. And you'll learn that speccing your class talents to work best with your weapons and your weapon properties and attributes will be a key part of the game, and there's a lot of mixtures and maxtures you could make. Mixtures and maxtures? Fuck it, it's staying in. Don't worry if you don't know much about the lore of Warhammer, it isn't necessary, but you'll pick up a little bit here and there through the excellent dialogue between the characters as they talk about the world around them and their relationship with the other characters, their histories, backstories. A lot of the dialogue is just well written and fun, and it seems really natural, and it's well voice acted. It lends a lot of life to a world that you just might not be very familiar with. The weapons, though, of Vermintide are varied and numerous. Each character has access to their own set of melee and ranged weapons, so only Carillion can use the spear, only Marcus can use the halberd, only Victor can use the rapier, etc., etc. Weapons differ from each other in the way they attack and the kinds of damage they inflict. Each weapon has an attack pattern for both light and heavy attacks. These attack patterns can be stabs, swipes, overhead strikes, all sorts of things. Different weapons can do different kinds of damage to both armored and unarmored enemies, since weapons in Vermintide have cleave, which is their ability to damage through the first enemy that they hit. Some weapons do high damage, but low cleave, so they can only hit one or a few enemies, but they do a great deal of damage. Some weapons do light damage, but slash across many enemies at once. In addition, weapons also have a counterattack, which is a quick attack made after using a shove. Some weapons are simpler to use than others and have less attack patterns in their moveset, so they're easier to master. For instance, the rapier's light attacks are always a low damaging but quick side-to-side slashing attack, but the charged attack is always a strong armor-piercing thrust forwards. But some weapons are a bit more complicated. So Sienna's fire sword is one of my favorite weapons in the game, but its attacks are a little bit more complicated. The light attacks are a left swing, then a right swing, and then a forward stab, which will set enemies on fire. But the fire sword's heavy attacks alternate between a flaming claw attack from the left, and then a slash from the right with the sword itself. But, depending on what direction the sword had been swung with the previous attack, it will affect the next attack that Sienna makes. So if I make a single light attack and then a charged attack, it will be the left claw strike. If I make 2 light attacks and the sword ends while traveling to the right, the next heavy attack will not begin with a claw attack, but with a sword swipe. But why would any of this matter? Well, like many weapons, different attacks have different results on enemies. The claw attack has infinite cleave, it will go through everything in front of you, but it does low damage, and it doesn't pierce armor, but it lights enemies on fire. So if there are multiple armored enemies in front of me, I want to use the claw to hit them, and it doesn't do direct damage, but it staggers them and sets them on fire, since the second power attack with the sword itself would only hit the first armored enemy, and then stop since it has much lower cleave. If I have more light enemies in front of me that are easier to cut through, I might prefer to make 2 light attacks and then use a charged attack so that instead of clawing at them, I use the sword's higher damaging potential and wider hit arc. It sounds complicated, but it's something you pick up over time, just intuitively. Vermintide has a high skill ceiling, and knowing what attacks to make in tandem with your positioning and footwork is essential. You block, you look for windows where you can counter, you dodge away from attacking enemies. It's an immensely rewarding game when you play it well. It makes you feel accomplished. The enemies of Vermintide are 2 different factions, the Skaven, vicious ratmen, and the Northlanders, barbaric servants of chaos. While both attack in large numbers, generally the Skaven have larger hordes with weaker enemies, and the Northlanders have slightly tougher individual troops. Both, however, are fun to fight, and I find myself not particularly preferring one to the other. Each faction has an array of armored and unarmored enemies with different strengths, attack animations, and resiliences. As you play, you learn just what foes are the most deadly, and how to anticipate their attacks and take them out. And, just like Left 4 Dead 2, there are special enemies as well thrown into the mix. These specials are what really remind you that Vermintide is a team-focused game. Specials can pounce upon your character, teleport around and grab you with a magic leash, pull you into hordes with a long man-catcher hook. And when your character has been incapacitated, there's no way for you to save yourself. Your team has to be there to save you, just like you have to be there to save your teammates. Not all specials instantly incapacitate you, some just make unique attacks. Rattling gunners will spool up a minigun and fire bullets towards you, and warp fire throwers will try to move in close and hose you down with green flames, for instance. Special enemies and their attacks pay no attention to their allies that get between themselves and you, which can be used to strategic advantage and shows just how ferociously they want to kill you. One thing I really like about Vermintide is how much counterplay there is between you and specials in ways that Left 4 Dead didn't quite offer. All of the enemies that can grab you can be dodged and avoided in ways that are far less janky and unpredictable as Left 4 Dead. Rats that can pounce on you can be sidestepped or even pushed out of the air with good timing. Rats with hooks can be dodged, and so can teleporting leeches. I'm not saying you couldn't do this in Left 4 Dead, but in Vermintide it's much more consistent, and you get much better audio clues that sound off as a warning that's vital to success. A good player can consistently keep dodging enemy specials the whole game. There are also boss enemies that your team can encounter, who are the toughest enemies in the game. They have great pools of health and can cause serious damage, and of the 4 bosses in the game, in addition to the lords at the end of some levels, they can be serious impediments to progress that require you to really work with your team to slay, since killing one on your own is an extremely difficult task, and it makes you value boss-killing classes. Players can ping enemies that highlights them in a blue outline to communicate with other players, and characters in the game will make appropriate callouts. The same can be done with items as well, bombs, potions, and healing stuff. While the gameplay and the combat of Vermintide is excellent, the progression and loot acquisition of Vermintide is unfortunately kind of a mixed bag. One that I would say leans toward the sides of frustration. So experience is awarded to the player when you complete a mission, and you have to get to the very end to get the rewards. Dying in the middle of a mission rewards you with some experience, but not nearly as much compared to being victorious. Each map, scattered around and hidden, are collectibles that make the run more difficult if you pick them up, but give rewards and bonuses upon completion. Maps have 2 grimoires and 3 tomes. Grimoires take up the place of a potion slot, and they lower the maximum amount of health each character can have while carried. Tomes don't make your character weaker in any way, but they occupy your healing item slot, meaning your team cannot carry as many healing items with them. At the end of the game, you are given extra experience for the books you carry, in addition to what difficulty you're playing, and how many heroes survive to see the end portal. Loot is given to you in what is essentially loot boxes. They come in varying rarities and qualities. Carrying more books, playing on higher difficulties, and collecting loot dice in the game will increase the quality of the loot box you get at the end of a run. Leveling up your characters, which can be done infinitely, as well as completing quests and missions, daily and weekly challenges, also awards loot boxes. So they're certainly not difficult to come by. But when you get a loot box, it's not opened immediately. Instead, it goes into your inventory, and you can open it at any time, and loot boxes will only give gear appropriate for the character who opens it. So completing a mission with Victor will give you a loot box, but if you open it with Sienna, you'll get items appropriate for her, not Victor. Unfortunately, the contents inside are random, so if you want a particular weapon or rarity or skin, it's all luck. Scrapping items you don't need will give you crafting materials that can be used to craft items, as well as mix up the traits and properties of the items you have. And this is, admittedly, probably the most frustrating aspect of the game, its reliance on luck to upgrade your equipment and acquire it in the first place. Properties are randomized on your items not only by their attributes, but by their amounts. It takes resources to roll for the properties of your gear, and you can literally spend resources to make your weapons objectively worse if you get bad random rolls. It's a terrible system in an otherwise mostly excellent game, and it stands out because of it. And I have found myself getting immensely frustrated because I'm trying to get a certain kind of property on my weapon, and I'm burning through large amounts of resources because my luck is just not with me that day. It's doubly frustrating since the first Vermintide had a better system for getting materials and items with their bounty board, and unfortunately, that seems to have gone by the wayside for the sequel. Let it not be misunderstood, there is a level of grind to Vermintide 2. It's inescapable, and if that's the kind of thing in games that really bugs you, then it may be really difficult for me to recommend this game to you, despite all its strengths. Important to note, though, loot boxes are all earned in-game. There are no microtransactions for buying these loot boxes. The game also uses a host to get games going, so one of the players will be the one that other players will rely on for connection, and a bad host means ping issues and connection issues, which will negatively impact the gameplay when timing is crucial for melee combat. And if the host disconnects, all progress for the run will be lost. A new host will be chosen, and the mission will reset at the beginning with no rewards doled out. Vermintide 2 on Steam features mod support with a workshop too, so you can enable sanctioned mods for quality of life improvements and still play officially to keep your progress and experience. But there's also other fun mods like Onslaught that turn the game into an insanely ridiculous war zone that substantially raises the amount of hordes and enemy spawns. DLCs add new weapons, cosmetics, and maps, and Vermintide 2 keeps its very generous business model in terms of DLC because only the host has to have the DLC for everybody else to play along with him. Which means if your friend has the DLC for Back to Ubersreich, then you could play with him and you could play on those maps alongside him. But nonetheless, despite these shortcomings, there's a reason I've put over 600 hours into Vermintide 2. I love the world, the characters, the combat. It's exciting, and it has a high skill ceiling, and I'm always pushing myself to get better and better. To kill more enemies as efficient as I can, and take less and less damage on my runs, and try to be the best I can be. And with the big expansion coming soon, I'm very optimistic for the future of this game. And even though I've put so many hours into it, it's a game that I can keep coming back to just to have a good time and press myself to do better, and savor the rewarding feeling that comes along with that. Oh, right, Vermintide 2 is a story about a rat portal or something.